A very warm welcome to my community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm pleased that you have joined us. Well, as expected after a devastating hurricane, a medical survey is typically conducted to assess the extent of medical emergencies and to identify any potential outbreaks of contagious diseases that could impact the population. In 1831, the authorities were particularly concerned about several key issues.
So we had gastrointestinal tract infections, we had skin and soft tissue infections, we also talked about tetanus, CNS infections. We can also think about respiratory tract infections. So persons would have been exposed to all the elements, particularly if you were, in the house and the roof blew off or the wall started to fall down or something, you're exposed to the elements. You were more likely than not to develop some sort of respiratory tract infection with the level of decreased immunity that is, associated with the fact that you were in that environment. So persons develop a lot of respiratory tract infections, a lot of things associated with the common cold or with viruses. Quite often they would have had that, but then also they would have developed other respiratory issues from fungi, or from mold. If you've been in a place that would have been wet and there was a lot of rain during that time, so because of that you would have been exposed to a lot of mold. It takes about 24 hours or between 24 to 48 hours for mold to develop in wet conditions. And so persons would start to develop a lot of fungal infections as well. There would have also been bacterial infections. There are some organisms like Legionella that's able to survive in water. They're able to survive in some amoeba in water. And once it's inhaled, once those organisms become aerosolized and you inhale them, then persons can become infected. So there were a lot of respiratory tract infections that would have also been commonplace at that time as well. Another thing that would have occurred at that point would have been what we kind of familiar with today. A lot of the vector-borne infections, because you're having collections of water, stagnant pools of water, you have sites for mosquito breeding. So at that point persons would have been exposed to the mosquitoes, malaria and yellow fever would have been predominating at that time. So you would have had an outbreak pretty much of malaria and yellow fever. In some instances, you probably would have had some level of dengue as well, but chikungunya and Zika virus would have come later on, more in our lifetime than in theirs. So it's unlikely that they would have seen those, but certainly malaria and yellow fever would have been endemic at that point, and so you would have also been exposed to that. Also, one of the other vector-borne infections we could think about would be leptospirosis. So leptospirosis is quite endemic in Barbados, and with, once again, flooding, the collection of water, persons having to wade through water without adequate foot protection, there would have been, and having lacerations and so forth, the organism would have been able to get in, because it only requires some form of microabrasion, a very small, almost indiscernible cut for the organism to be able to get into the skin. And so the organism is able to get in, and then you get, within a few days, then persons manifest the signs and symptoms of leptospirosis. So you get the yellowing of the eyes, the urine and so forth, the yellowing of the skin. So you get a lot of organs being affected with leptospirosis. So leptospirosis would have been one of the common organisms that would have caused infections at that point in time as well.
Death came to all, and the burying of the dead was imperative in these times because there were so many who passed during the passage of the hurricane. The figures are estimated between just under 2,000 persons. Others believe that it was between 4,000 to 5,000 persons.
As it relates to the death toll, the number of deaths vary according to the source. Some sources indicate that the death toll would have been around 1,500 persons. Other sources state that the death toll may have been as high as 2,500 persons.
But whatever the number was, it was many persons had perished during this hurricane. And persons have to look of ways and means of burying their loved ones as quickly as possible. So some were conveyed in coffins, others were on trees, others were any other material that was found available. You didn't have time to grieve for your loved ones because decomposition could have set in at any time. You were in the tropics, there was rainwater everywhere that became stagnant. You had to deal with mosquitoes, other rodents and pests. So it was imperative that you bury your loved ones as soon as possible. And this was one of the consequences of the passage of the hurricane.
Well, they would have had to, in terms of making sure that water was adequate, one of the primary things that they would have done first was to make sure that all the persons that they found dead were buried in proper graves, as well as all the animals, you know, to prevent further contamination of any sources. And then to make sure that all debris was removed from all the waterways and stuff like that, to clear out all those places, to make sure that you still had some level of adequate water. And then remember, a lot of these plantations also had wells. So they would have probably gone back to the wells, if they were not contaminated in any way, to use the water from the wells, likely through boiling the water would have been a good way to ensure that the water was still, the water was adequate. Outside of the infections, you would have had food spoilage. A lot of the fields were flattened, particularly a lot of the corn fields, a lot of the cane fields, and so would have been flattened.
Eyewitnesses indicate that the landscape was like that of a desert. In the first instance, many of the plantations were destroyed. So you would have had instances where the great house or the plantation house would have suffered tremendous damage or would have been completely destroyed. The slave huts or the slave yards where the enslaved persons lived, many of those structures were built haphazardly with inferior materials, and many of those slave huts would have also been destroyed. Some of the slaves would have been entombed in their slave huts.
And those who remained lost their dwellings, so people were absolutely homeless.
Also on the plantations, you had the storehouses, which would have stored the yams, etc., the sugar, the molasses, and so on. Many of those plantation storehouses were also destroyed.
Leaving the estates, it is said, with not one item of food. So people were foraging in ruins trying to find food to eat. It brings a moment of pause to even think that people at all levels of society were rendered destitute, losing all that they had the day before the hurricane, and most not even having a roof over their heads the next day. In some cases, they were just wandering around.
Prior to the hurricane, many of the planters were quite self-congratulatory. They were very proud and expectant because the land was luxuriant, the crops were growing well, and they were expecting a bountiful harvest. Lo and behold, as a result of the hurricane, persons indicate that many of the plantations were laid bare and that many of them had no food or no provisions for the enslaved. Fortunately, the sugar and rum and molasses that would have been exported in that year would have been exported prior to the hurricane, or else the financial calamity may have been worse. On the plantations, the livestock also suffered tremendously. The horses, pigs, cows, sheep, etc. They would have had their nostrils, their ears, their eyes filled with grits and gravel and marl, and there are reports of many of the animals on the plantations dying as a result of the hurricane. Furthermore, first-hand witnesses indicate that when horses were released from their stalls, that they cantered about wildly, and some of them threw themselves over precipices into the ocean.
The hurricane has struck the island, disrupting the regular food supply. As a result, the enslaved population is now bracing for the severe impact of this interruption.
I want to discuss the enslaved people when it came to food shortages. Slavery was still around, and they knew that in the food chain, they would have been at the bottom of the food chain.
So enslaved people who occupied the lowest rung of Barbadian society at that time are likely to have suffered the greatest loss. So if you were in your home and your home was just a wattle and daub cottage, or if your enslaver had invested since the 1780 hurricane in storm housing that was a little stronger, stone storm housing. Sometimes we call these slave huts on the island, but these are the storm houses that were associated with that kind of development. And some of these survived. A lot of the buildings fell in, but this would have been the greatest loss, the experience of the greatest loss for enslaved people at the time. And we have reports of enslaved people looking to their masters, looking to their enslavers for refuge and support during the hurricane. They would shelter with their enslavers in the cellar area of the house, and if the house was able to withstand the kind of shock of falling walls, so walls falling in on each other and then falling through the flooring, it's at this point that some enslaved people could survive.
In the leeward part of the island, there was some, infraction or rebellion where they enslaved on certain estates, specifically Spring Head, Spring Garden in St. Lucie.
At the Spring Garden plantation, the slaves plundered whatever food was available. They stole bushels of corn. They stole whatever foodstuffs were available.
At that plantation, the enslaved people refused to obey the orders of the manager and the overseer. But beyond that refusal, they also went into a cornfield around the 13th of August, a cornfield, and appropriated an entire field of corn. Whole field of corn gone. They brought into the boiling house and curing house and took 250 gallons of molasses. Now, why would they? We know why they would take the corn, but why would they take the molasses? Of course, molasses was used as a sweetener in those days. But they didn't stop there. They went for the turkeys as well. And you could understand, therefore, that these persons might have prepared a meal after the hurricane. Turkey, corn, and while they were at it, they decided to take some gunpowder. Now, that is something of seriousness, to take gunpowder from the planters. Because the taking of gunpowder means that you're really looking to overthrow the plantation regime. You're looking now at serious political business.
And many of the planters were fearful that an outright rebellion was possible.
Keep in mind that we are relying on records created by a specific segment of the society. These records reveal that various activities took place on several plantations, including
Spring Head, Spring Garden in St. Lucie, Broomfield. They brought the corn from the stalk. Now, they said the stalks were damaged, but not the corn. The corn was still salvageable.
The enslaved people stole or appropriated the plantation bull. and took 11 hogs from the plantation. And of course, you would imagine that they might have cut up that meat, slaughtered the animal, and had a feast. The enslaved people were behaving unruly, would not obey orders, and they sent for the military. They sent for the military, and the military came down from Dover Fort or Dover Castle, which is on the premises of what we now call the Coleridge and Parry School. And one enslaved man struck down a soldier. Yes, struck him down and attempted to take his gun. The soldier's comrade pulled his pistol and shot the man.
At the Black Bess plantation, the owner there reported that the slaves were issuing threats and they were refusing to obey orders.
Over at Haman's, one man went over there, tried to persuade the enslaved people at Haman's to join the rebellion, but the people at Haman's refused and grabbed him, locked him up, and handed it over to the military.
The militia, once they had been informed of such behavior by the enslaved in the north of Barbados, they would have marched from plantation to plantation to quell any insurrectionary behavior and to ensure that order was maintained.
And the militia, according to the report, at each stage, they surrounded the Negro houses and they formed a crescent shape. And they were prepared to shoot.
Sir Reginald Allen, he was in control of the militia, and he spoke to the enslaved on the estate, appealing to them in a conciliatory manner to calm down and let them know that everyone was facing this crisis.
Of course, some of these, the ringleaders, were arrested and given lashes. But at one stage, at Broomfield, the matter got so heated that the militia leader said that we will be prepared to shoot if this thing got out of hand. So we had, therefore, in 1831, a rebellion that has not really been recorded. But not only do we have a rebellion, but we have the governor and the assembly scurrying to put laws into practice. So, for example, the governor made a proclamation published in the Barbadian saying that the magistrates and the militia, they have the full authority to put down any rebellion and to stop the plunder that might have occurred. Secondly, the legislature passed a law in Barbados mandating all enslaved blacks, all of them, to come out and clean up the streets and clean up the plantation. And of course, those people who refused, the penalty for refusal was imprisonment and of course a flogging. So that the cleanup of the plantations, the cleanup of the city, the cleanup of Bridgetown was done by, not by the prisoners, but by enslaved people.
There was some unity because everyone, what the hurricane did, it created a level playing field because whether you're black or white, slave or master, young or old, rich or poor, you face loss of loved ones, loss of your home, and loss of, in the case of the master, your income, a business owner, your income.
Within 3 years, we would have the abolition of slavery itself, and 4 years later, emancipation. To look at how slave owners and slave masters lived is quite individual as to whether they were humane or not. It would depend on the personality of the master himself, whether he treated his people humanely or not. And over time, what I like as I do research and look more and more into history, because initially from secondary school, you look at slavery, you look at the black and white situation only, and everybody was cruel, said to be cruel and all that. But as I dig deeper, I realize that change, you know how change, they say change is the only constant in life, but people seem to think that change ain't coming, that they will have their way all the time. And it's interesting to me how over time certain circumstances will change in Barbados along a trajectory, you know, not mainstream nor in a flare or anything like that, but subtle changes will start to happen that would push us closer and closer toward emancipation over the centuries. Not over months or a few years, over centuries. That change will start to shift the winds and bring emancipation to our doors. But some plantation owners were humane, and some were very cruel.
Even as the hurricane struck, the enslaved people were also looking to have their emancipation. They were not content. They were not content to simply go along as enslaved people, but they wanted emancipation. And they used the hurricane of 1831 to strike.
The enslaved population's creativity and innate will to survive drove them to make the best use of the resources available in their environment. But how did the authorities respond?
Governor Sir James Lyons immediately wrote the colonial secretary indicating the parlous state of Barbados and the abysmal destruction. The British Parliament voted £100,000 to hurricane relief for Barbados, St. Vincent and St. Lucia, and Barbados would have received £75,000 of that figure. Also in England, various charities and various persons would have raised funds for Barbados. As it relates to other islands, after some 8 days or 8 days after the hurricane, ships would have started to bring supplies from other islands to help those persons in Barbados who were destitute as a result of the hurricane. Also, there were humanitarian groups in Barbados that would have established soup kitchens, and these soup kitchens would have fed the poor and needy and the homeless at different locations in Bridgetown.
In Barbados, the 1831 allowed the British colonial authorities to see the significance of assisting the estates, the plantations, with the rebuilding process. So they quickly rebounded, and that's largely through the efforts of the London officials. For example, the Barbadian planters were able to import lumber and other supplies at reduced tariffs to facilitate the rebuilding process, with the understanding that they were not to re-export these imports to other territories to make profits.
After the hurricane, there were fears that some unscrupulous business persons would engage in profiteering. The governor, however, declared that he had found no evidence of business persons and merchants engaging in that practice, and rather that they had kept their prices stable. There was an issue in terms of building materials, because most of the building materials would have been imported. So with such widespread destruction, there would have been a shortage initially of these building materials. Some persons petitioned the governor to remove the taxes on building materials so that the price would not be astronomical. The governor indicated that he was unable to do so, he thought it imprudent to do so, but he believed that once the supplies of wood from overseas and other building materials had returned to a state of normalcy, that the pricing structure would remain as it was prior to the hurricane.
And thank you very much, Achuri. The story of the great hurricane of 1831 as experienced by our people, as researched and shared by our people right here on Mind Community. If you'd like to share your community story, please get in touch with us. We are here to record and share with all. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Be good to yourself and look out for the interests of your neighbors.